This is Indian Country Today.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Trahant. Here are the headlines from Indian Country Today. The Shoshone-Bannock tribes in Idaho have won a long legal fight with a chemical company over an annual fee. Waste from FMC's now closed phosphorus processing plant is located on the Fort Hall Indian Reservation. Bill Bacon, lead counsel for the tribes, tells us what the $1.5 million a year fee will cover.
So FMC sat down at the negotiation table, and we the tribes and FMC agreed that $1.5 million a year should cover the cost of monitoring and observing the hazardous waste on this 1,500-acre Superfund site.
And co-counsel for the tribes, Paul Echohawk, explains why the Supreme Court decision is a crucial victory.
For tribes to be able to assert their regulations over non-Indian companies on non-Indian fee land within reservation territories is an important part of a tribe's exercise of their sovereignty.
Safe cleanup of the Superfund site is complicated by the Federal Environmental Protection Administration's rules that some of the material is too toxic to even be exposed to air and must be buried in place. The tribal money will be used to monitor that storage. Across the country, urban Indian health clinics and the Indian Health Service are starting to vaccinate tribal elders as they finish vaccinating first responders. In cities like Phoenix and Denver, elders are getting the first dose of the vaccine. The Denver Indian Health and Family Services held its first vaccination clinic last week at the Denver Indian Center. The Denver Channel reports that a total of 120 Native people received the vaccination. They had hoped to vaccinate 150. Pharmacy students who attend the University of Colorado served as volunteers to give the shots. Each person must return in 30 days to get the second vaccine. For the indigenous populations in North Dakota, the solution to justice and equality is increased sovereignty. A former U.S. attorney told CBS affiliate KXMB that there has been a movement in that direction since the 1970s. And for the last 50 years, each tribe in the state has been growing and determining its own path. Chairman Mark Fox of the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation says the road to independence means mirroring the U.S. government. In his final 2 years as chairman, Fox says his top priority is to make revisions to MHA's constitution. This includes creating a 3-branch government with a separation of powers and setting term limits. MHA's Tribal Business Council still must adopt any changes before tribal law can be changed. The only man in more than 200 years to be given the title of Beloved Man by the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians will now also have a highway dedicated in his honor. The Tribal Council bestowed Dr. Jerry Wolf the honorable title of Beloved Man in 2013. He was the first to hold such a prestigious honor since the tribe's last beloved man died in 1801. The tribe is located in North Carolina, and the State Board of Transportation recently approved a resolution to name 4.2 miles of Highway 441 as Beloved Man, Dr. Jerry Wolf Highway. Wolf, born in 1924, served in the Navy from 1943 to 1950. He was a signalman, second class, and was the only Native American in his division. This year, Cinematters New York Social Justice Film Festival is featuring 2 films around Native issues. And one of the featured Indigenous films is 2019's The Condor and the Eagle. The documentary follows the journey for climate justice from the Canadian Boreal Forest to the Amazon rainforest. JCC's Manhattan's director for film, Isaac Zablocki, told us 2 reasons the film was picked for their festival.
The Condor and the Eagle also is about the environment, and this is, of course, another crucial topic, and we get to highlight 2 themes, really, in one film, which is great.
The second annual Cinematters is running virtually from January 14th to the 18th. Head to cinematters.film to explore the full lineup and register. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Mark Trahant. We'll be right back with a look at corporate boards and how a new law could impact tribal people. A new law in California requires publicly held companies headquartered in that state to include board members from underrepresented communities. The number of Native Americans serving on corporate boards is so low that it would be impossible to track. Rebecca Adamson, Cherokee Nation, is an economist who's worked for decades on social investing and corporate governance. She was the founder of First Peoples Worldwide and was the first Native American to serve on the board of Calvert Investment Funds, one of the largest socially responsible investment management companies in the United States. Rebecca Adamson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for covering such an important topic. As we go forward, businesses are going to play a huge role in all of our lives, and we need to be at the table.
Well, let's set the stage. Maybe go back to the first time when you joined Calvert Fund. There just weren't Native Americans in that sphere at all. What was it like?
And I'm sorry to say there's still not enough of us there. But what's interesting is this whole topic of diversity and the value behind diversity. I was actually asked onto the Calvert Social Investment Funds because of the work I was doing with the Lakota people on Pine Ridge in establishing the Lakota Fund. And the micro enterprise work, the micro lending, the community development financial institutions that we were working with tribes to create and establish became such a bandwagon through the country that as a mutual fund, they wanted to understand about it. And they really brought me on to create a national sort of private sector community development financial intermediary. And so it came out of diversity to begin with. My experience on Calvert, I went on the board in 1989. Back in those days, it was called high social impact investing. And I was actually charged with creating this private sector vehicle. And over the course of the years, we interviewed surveyed our trustees and our shareholders, and they were behind it. And this was the eye opener for me, Mark, on what it means to be on some of these boards. We went to the shareholders, they voted to put 1% of our portfolio into community development, low income lending mechanisms. That 1% represented $750 million. It was like I'd been doing fundraising all my life. I got a $10,000 grant. I got a $15,000 grant. I got 100. And then it's like all of a sudden I'm in the area of hundreds of millions of dollars and directing the flow. And so that's where this happens. And that's where we have to be. I went on there, and once we did what became community notes, and over the first 10 years, it raised $2 billion in community notes, investing into low income. That all came out of Indigenous thinking right from the Lakota Fund. Then I was able to really focus on Indigenous people's rights, and I created the first Indigenous people's investment screen. I compiled all of our declarations of rights into a set of criteria for investors. And by 1999, it was becoming the first Indigenous people's investment screen and helping investors select companies that were upholding our rights or avoiding those that weren't. Since that, I also went out and trained 600 brokers on the screen. We get pushback in weird places. We had the environmentalists saying, oh, we cover Indigenous people under our environment screens. We had human rights saying they covered Indigenous people under the human rights. It didn't include our intellectual property. It didn't include our culture. It didn't include self-determinations. So it's just key. And it was because an Indian person was there that it was able to really address those things that are so crucial to us, like self-determination. So we have to have some kind of unified way to look at board diversity with Indian country being part of that equation.
Well, when you think of the private sector, it seems to me the two greatest assets of Indian country are young people and land. And taking both of those into the private sector matches what the private sector is interested in anyway.
Oh, it's a complete matchup. What they're really interested in at that board level is risk and mitigating risk. And Indigenous people bring a set of experiences and a set of values that really are needed in this conversation in corporate America now more than ever before. they've tended to look at skill sets, like financial skill sets primarily. There's no legal requirement that you have an MBA or be a financial analyst. There's no legal requirement on the skills that are required to be a trustee on corporate America. They've locked it into a rather myopic view of what those skills are, but they're starting to be forced into out of that box and looking at new skill sets. There's a field in investing called environmental, social, and governance investing, ESG investing. And when you look at the social issues there and you look at social risk, Native American people really have a tremendous amount to bring to the table on just what you said, looking at land. I mean, if you look at all of the mining operations, well, let's do extractive industry on indigenous territories. There was a study done by Professor Whithold a couple of years ago from Wharton School who showed that 160% of the risk goes up when you're operating on indigenous territories. Now, what would make the most sense to mitigate that risk? Have indigenous experts on your board. A NASDAQ, by the way, has just filed with the SEC to require board diversity. So come December, this gets bigger and bigger. They're just filed, but it will start probably rolling out second or third quarter of this year.
What companies do you think will be the first to jump onto that?
Well, the ones that should be are the extractive industries, because they really have, we proved with DAPL, the brilliance out at DAPL and the activists and the tribes and the voice that was heard at DAPL really proved the risk behind operating on indigenous lands without any skill set there to advise you. When we reviewed the companies, there was absolutely only 2 companies of the 52 extractive companies in the US that even had a social committee that would look at this kind of risk. And yet Energy Transfer Partners stock lost 60% of its value because of the social risk by ignoring indigenous rights. I also think that, any industry that's working on land-based utilities, agriculture, transportation, those really need to look at indigenous expertise. But even beyond that, fashion industry, we've seen cultural appropriation in the fashion industry. Dolce & Gabbana just really went up against the wall when they really blew it in China with their last supposedly fashion show. I mean, it would be a better question to say who wouldn't benefit by having indigenous people and expertise, experience, and our values at the table.
What kind of people should be from Indian countries should be serving on these boards?
Well, it's a double-edged sword in some ways, because if they just put one of us on, they can just talk over us, and you can bring the idea and put it on the table and watch it sort of fall off the edge. So it's better if they would do a sort of a 2 or 3, or set up an advisory group to sort of support the individual person. I mean, but we all know the double-edged sword too. I mean, like if you really look at the African-American community, we could look at, Clarence Thomas or Daniel Cameron, the Attorney General in Kentucky, who just, African-American who ruled that there was no problem with killing Breonna Taylor. There's this value framework that I think we tend to really bring into this. But again, we have to have Indian people that have experience in the community, that have values of the community, that are rooted in self-determination. Because right now what it is it's a self-identification. And we really have to have some kind of accountability back to our people and have a voice that links back in a way that captures. I mean, one of the values I think I brought was all of the field work we had done, working directly with communities, allowed us to really understand social license to operate. And that's a requirement in ESG. That S stands for a social license. That means the community where you are, or the community at large, approves of your operations and wants you to exist. Now, when that social license is not provided, and we've seen that, that's what we see time and time again, when that social license is not upheld, risk goes up. Risk goes up exponentially. I said 160% it goes up when you're working on indigenous lands, because none of these guys had tribal authority to be there. No one had approved their operations. So for Native people, I wouldn't limit us to the extractive industry, but in looking at the environment and where the planet is going, those companies need our leadership the most. But our skill set goes very broad across corporate operations in many, many sectors. And I would encourage some unity that allows, like through Indian country today, to start showing. People tend to look at this skill set in boxes. I mean, legally, they could put Daffy Duck on the board. They are not required to follow any prescription of skill sets and expertise. We need to translate. I mean, one of the skill sets that translate, the community development financial institutions operating with tribal communities bring a skill set that almost overlays with a lot of these corporate boards. Sometimes they're looking for sales. Sometimes they're looking for international expertise. I mean, we're going up to the UN now. We're representing Native people. We're linked to Indigenous people. There's plenty of room for the role and the experience, the values, and the skills that we bring to the board. I do think we have to be organized to reach that, though, Mike. It's not going to happen in a vacuum, and they're not going to really go out of their way to find us. I sat in that boardroom, and I couldn't count how many times I heard, we're just looking for a qualified minority. We just want to qualify. Well, I think Donald Trump breaks that myth. I mean, when you're talking about qualified anything, I used to say, give us some of the incompetent slots, but for some reason, we were held to this qualified minority standard when we clearly saw it wasn't happening on the other side. We've got to make a case seriously, and we got to present our skills within a business model. But I say this lightly, but also directly, that box has to open up, and we should be part of opening that box up and requiring they recognize the value of our Indigenous leadership.
Rebecca, this is going to be a topic we'll be following. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Joaqlin Estus is our national correspondent based in Anchorage. She joins us now to talk about her recent story, Arctic oil gas leases get cool reception. Welcome, Joaqlin.
Hey, thank you. Good to be here.
So the Trump administration had this very enthusiastic trying to get out this big lease sale, and something happened along the way. Maybe tell us about it.
Yeah, so they had a lease sale, and the Department of Interior offered 22 tracts of land for sale in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for oil and gas development, and they got 11 bids, with half of what they were offering. And most of the bids were from the state of Alaska, and the bid amounts were very low. So it was a disappointment, and there were several reasons for that. One is that there's a glut of oil on the international and national markets. The price of oil is very low, and there's opposition to drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So people had gone into this with really high hopes. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that there are 5 to 10 billion barrels of oil in the refuge. And for comparison, the reserve, the oil under Prudhoe Bay was 15 billion barrels. And That's been getting drawn out of the ground for 20, 25 years. And it's created a lot of jobs, and it's funded 90% of the state government in Alaska. So that's something, Alaskans, most Alaskans, the state and the congressional delegation all like. They would like to keep those revenues coming in. And they've been lobbying to get the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge opened to oil and gas development for decades, for 40 years. So they finally got their wish in 2017. Congress passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and it mandated that the refuge be open to oil and gas development. So the Trump administration was rushing to get oil and gas leases signed before President Trump left office. And then they got this very cool reception from oil companies.
But when you think about it, even if they're rushing to get it done in one administration, these investments are projects that are going to last decades. And so to put up that much money for something that could change by a new administration, it's pretty risky.
Yeah, well, so what's going to happen next is the Department of Interior will announce who won the bid, which companies' bids they'll accept, and then they'll sign leases. And then those companies will have to apply for permits, and they'll be applying for permits from, the Biden administration. So yeah, things could change a lot.
How are the Alaska Native communities viewing this? I know there's a division, but just how does that conversation occur in Alaska?
Well, under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, Native for-profit corporations were created, and their mission is to make money, and then they issue dividends to their shareholders out of the profits. And so there are two Inupiat Native corporations on the North Slope, and there's one Athabascan corporation in the interior of Alaska, and they all have subsidiaries that provide services to the oil industry. So as development goes forward in the refuge, they'll make money out of that. And so they support opening the refuge to oil and gas development. However, there are Gwich'in Athabascan people who live in the region and across the border into Canada. They oppose development in the refuge because the porcupine caribou herd goes there. It has 200,000 caribou, and this herd migrates from Canada back to the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's a 1.5 to 2,000 mile trek. They do it every year. And the reason they do it is because the coastal plain is such great habitat for them to give birth. So if you think about it, the Gwich'in Athabascan have lived in the area for millennia, as have the Inupiaq, and the Athabascans, their entire way of life and culture developed and evolved around the caribou. And so the calving grounds are sacred to the Gwich'in Athabascans. So that's why they oppose development. And they're both involved in commenting on different things. The Gwich'in Athabascan and several other tribes and 15 states from across the country, as well as conservation groups, have all joined together and in lawsuits. There are dozens of lawsuits over this. And something else that's happened. So even though the Department of Interior is saying, yes, let's develop, these lawsuits are one obstacle. Another hurdle is that banks and financial institutions across the country have issued statements saying they will not finance development in this refuge. And they're doing it not only because it's controversial, but also because there's risk. I mean, anytime you drill for oil, you may not get oil. And when you're drilling for oil in the Arctic, you can run into problems, and that takes more money. And so it increases the risk of loss.
Thank you for following this important story, Joaqlin, and thank you for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure.
And that is a slice of our Indigenous world today. Thank you for watching. We will be back with another edition tomorrow. I'm Mark Trahant.
You got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
Indian Country Today is recorded at the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is Indian Country Today.